I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily, where later we are heading to Scotland. The SNP's John Swinney launching their manifesto today, with polls suggesting they're on track to lose a significant number of seats. Tamara Cohen was there. She'll be here shortly. But speaking of polls, YouGov has just released the latest in its regular polling data for Sky News. They've consistently shown Labour with a commanding lead and potentially a huge majority the other side of the election. Our deputy political editor is Sam Coots, and he joins us from Westminster, where, as you are about to hear, the builders are in, maybe fixing the roof whilst the sun is shining. Sam, this latest set of data, do we see any movement in it?
Yes, absolutely. In the opposite direction to what the guy who called the election would have wanted to see, Rishi Sunak. The Tories are taking an, wait for it, absolute hammering, and it's seeping through the walls of this place. I have to say, normally in election time, you get some movement in the other direction. You see a sort of tightening of the polls. That is not what this projection from YouGov suggests. Labour is now on course for a majority of, well, in this projection, it's exactly 200. That still breaks all records that we have seen. It is a bigger majority than the first polling projection we had at the start of June, which put it at 193. And it suggests that the Tories will slump to the lowest number of seats since the Tories were founded at the start of the 19th century. This is the second biggest majority in British political history, is what we're heading for. It would totally upturn British politics if we saw anything like this. And I have to say, the first question that anybody will be thinking is it right? And there are lots of different pollsters trying this newish technique of polling projections, and they're all coming in at sort of very, very roughly around this level. So unless there is the most seismic upset, or the pollsters have got it so wrong that none of them should ever work again, we are on the cusp of a complete redrawing of the fabric of our political landscape.
An awful lot of attention, of course, in this election, not directed at Labour and indeed the Conservatives. What of the smaller parties from this bit of MRP analysis?
Well, let me run you through the numbers. One of the interesting things is just how well the smaller parties doing, both in vote share and in numbers. Under this, the Conservatives would go down to 108 seats. Now, you've got to remember, in 2019, Boris Johnson won 365 seats. So that is not only record-breaking, but a complete decimation compared to just 5 years ago. The Labour Party, well, they would essentially have 425 seats. I mean, that is an absolutely commanding position from which a Starmer government would have almost guaranteed no problem from the Commons, and beats all previous records for Labour since its creation, including Tony Blair in 1997. The Liberal Democrats, well, my goodness, are they the big winners? One of the biggest bits of movement since the last MRP at the start of June. They would now win 67 seats. Remember, they just got 11 in 2019. So that would be incredible, and it'd be the highest number since the formation of the Lib Dems. The SNP, well, they look like they're getting decimated. 48 in 2019, down to 20 in this projection. And under this one, unlike the last time, Nigel Farage wins. He wins his own seat in Clacton, and actually Reform, his party, Reform UK, get 5 seats. Greens on 2 and Plaid on 1. All of this, I have to say, Neil, is on a sort of vote share, sort of with Labour on less than you think. That incredible majority and that record-breaking tally is still only with Labour on 39%, the Tories on 22%. So there have been bigger leads for Labour. But I think the efficiency of the Labour vote, by which I mean Labour isn't piling up votes in safe seats. Instead, Brexit voters are coming back to them in seats that had been Tory, changing them from blue to red in large numbers, plus a sort of big increase in Reform, just decimating the Tory vote.
Does this mean that when Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, and others this week have been coming out and warning of a Labour supermajority, they might have a point?
Because you've got to remember what Grant Shapps is doing and what Conservative headquarters is trying to do with this campaigning technique. When they look at the polling, they can see 9 out of 10 Tories don't want a Labour supermajority and they want Tory votes to turn out. They can see something like 8 out of 10 Reform voters, or people who say they're going to vote Reform at the moment, saying that they don't want a Labour supermajority. So could that pull off a proportion of those and convince them to vote Tory rather than something that allows more Labour MPs? I mean, this is a supermajority like we've never seen before, and certainly suggests that the executive won't have much challenge in the Commons chamber, and the dominance of a Keir Starmer Labour majority, certainly in parliamentary terms, would feel pretty absolute.
But is there anything necessarily wrong with Labour enjoying a significant majority that will allow them to push through the manifesto proposals on which they are going to the country right now? I mean, 2019, a majority of 80, in my mind, sounds pretty super.
I think that big majorities have advantages and disadvantages for the sort of leaders that win them. The advantages are clear. You just don't have to worry about Parliament. You know, your legislation needs a majority. Well, you're going to get a majority unless something goes horribly, horribly wrong. And, you know, there will be scrutiny from select committees, but if those committees are dominated by Labour folk, that scrutiny will probably feel slightly less intense than it otherwise would do. Can parties still find ways of challenging the leader? Are there internal opposition voices? Could caucuses form that challenge the leader from the inside of the Labour Party? Of course they can. We've barely scratched the surface on the internal politics of an incoming Labour Keir Starmer administration, and just like any government we've ever covered, Keir Starmer will undoubtedly have challenges. It also doesn't automatically mean that because you have a big majority, you do good legislation. Remember, Neil, my favourite set of statistics this election. So Keir Starmer on course for a 200 majority, according to YouGov. The very same YouGov that says 49% of people think Keir Starmer will be a bad Prime Minister. But the public are not expecting him to walk on water. Anything like these kinds of numbers would mean that you don't have a sense of fear of Parliament and a fear of scrutiny and a necessity to make compromise that, you know, at points in our political history has proved helpful, and challenge to a sort of overbearing executive, you know, has often improved legislation and curbed some of the worst excesses. Maybe it'll enable Keir Starmer to get on with whatever he thinks the job is that he needs to do from July the 5th. But there are often some grumblings about an overmighty government with too little checks and balances.
But let's take our attention back to this side of polling day. And we should say a bit of good news for the Conservatives. It emerged too late, of course, to affect the YouGov data. But it's some good news, which, of course, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, can take complete credit for, or perhaps not.
That's right. I mean, good news, Neil. Prices are still going up.
Yeah.
They're just going up by an amount that is considered acceptable by the Bank of England. And in the medium term, I think you will see interest rates starting to come down to reflect the new inflation figures. The delivery of the number one promise that Rishi Sunak set out to deliver when he became Prime Minister, interest rates, has been one of the biggest squeezes on household incomes, and as a consequence, been one of the biggest political problems for Rishi Sunak. This good news has probably just come too late. I think that the election was probably timed so that you could get today's announcement during the campaign. It just is a point where it feels like there aren't many things that can kickstart this effort by the Tories to save as many Tory candidates as possible, just because where we are with just barely 2 weeks to go.
I have been scratching my head and trying to imagine situations in which things could get better for the Conservatives. And frankly, I have struggled. I've come up with a big fat zero. I mean, I suppose the point is, how do you shift the dial when the dial appears to be completely stuck?
So I think there's one really interesting thing in the data. We are seeing a drifting down of the proportion of people that are going to vote Labour. And it's been drifting down a little bit for over a week now. Now, has that figure stabilised? Could it go up again? Or if it continues to drift down yet further, could we just see a little cooling off of the Labour majority numbers and the Labour MP numbers? That's one of the things I'm quite curious about just in the last 2 weeks. I do wonder, the Tories have now settled on what their campaign playbook is going to look like. It's going to be push Labour on tax. And I have to say, Labour's campaign book has not been as robust and as well thought out as I perhaps thought it might be. Flip-flopping around on, for instance, whether VAT should be protected from raises in the next Parliament. It was a surprise that they hadn't kind of completely thought that out. Keir Starmer has long promised not to raise taxes on working people, but his definition of what a working person is seems to flip-flop around quite a lot, and so too does that of, depending on which member of the shadow cabinet is talking, what they say to that question as well. So they must think that there can be a bit of squeeze as a result of pushing this message that taxes will go up under a Labour government. Maybe that will have a bit of effect combined with don't give Labour a super majority, and that is their best closing argument to the electorate that could just keep some Labour folk at home, get a bit of turnout in favour of the Tories and claw back a bit of the reform vote. That's what those, basically still trying to go after Tory 2019 voters that have drifted off elsewhere or are planning to stay at home. I think those two messages on tax and the supermajority are the best thing that Isaac Levito's operation have found to try and stem the bleeding. But my goodness, Neil, it probably is well past the moment that it's too late.
Given all of that, Sam, is it simply time for us to stop polling? I mean, is there any point in you and I having this discussion the next time a bit of YouGov work comes out which tells us pretty much the same thing it told us the last time and pretty much the same thing it told us the time before that?
I tend to take the view that we may as well have all the data that's available to us because things do change. If we don't talk about polling, then you can be sure as anything that the parties are behind closed doors. And it does give clues both to the present and to the future. And keeping a very close eye on the electorate is what elections is all about. So I would continue to have a look. There will be one more big polling projection just before election day. That really is squeaky bum time, not just for the political parties, but for the pollsters themselves. We have given a lot of prominence to YouGov. And all I can say, guys, is you better not be too wrong.
And the same applies to yourself, Sam. Sam Coots, many thanks. In just a moment, we are heading to Scotland for the SNP Manifesto launch. Stay put. Welcome back. A busy day in politics north of the border as well. The SNP's leader and, of course, Scotland's First Minister, John Swinney, announcing the Scottish National Party's manifesto. There to listen to all of it, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, who joins us now. Tamara, good to see you. Look, clearly, the SNP in Scotland, according to the polls at the very least, are on the back foot. So this was an all-important day. For someone, who I have to say, is perhaps viewed as a bit of an interim leader for the SNP.
That's right. I mean, what an election for the SNP. They got a new leader, John Swinney, just 2 weeks before the election was called. And obviously they've had a very turbulent year with 3 leaders in 15 months. And we now have this story, evidence in poll after poll about Labour's recovery in Scotland, that Labour are going to really clean up in Scotland at the expense of the SNP. And of course, that raises the big question, if the SNP are going to lose loads of seats, what does that mean for their signature issue, which is independence? So real fight for their lives, I think, for John Swinney and the SNP to show why they can still deliver and why they remain relevant if they are going to lose a lot of seats here in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, John Swinney himself suggested ahead of the manifesto launch that independence would be page 1, line 1. And once you got past the front cover, of course, with a picture of John Swinney on it, seems like all the parties are going for that these days. You go to the first sentence, which says, vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. If that is page 1, line 1, Tamara, what is page 1, line 2? How on earth is that going to happen?
Look, what they're trying to say and what all the questions focused on is how on earth does this happen? Whether it's the Tories or whether it's Labour, and obviously all the polls indicate a Labour victory, they've said we're not having another referendum. And what the SNP have been saying for some time, and John Swinney has repeated, is that if they win a majority of the seats in Scotland, there are 57 Westminster constituencies in Scotland at this election, and at the last election, the SNP won 48. So they're saying if they win a majority, and that's just 29, so they lose 20 seats, that's still a mandate to discuss independence, to press Westminster for another referendum. Now, I asked John Swinney in our interview afterwards, isn't that just absolutely ludicrous that you could lose 20 seats and still call that a mandate for independence? And he said he thought it was. And he also said that back in 2021, when there were the Scottish Parliament elections, he said that was a mandate for independence because the SNP stood on a platform of making Scotland an independent country, and the number of MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, who were elected, not just the SNP, but also the Greens, who wanted to deliver that, was a majority. And I think the story of this election is that for many voters in Scotland, independence is still a live question. The number of people who believe in independence is still about 50-50. It's where it was when they had the referendum. But for many voters, it has slipped down their list of priorities. They're now more concerned about the economy. They're more concerned about public services. And therefore, the SNP's promises about independence, I think, have to recede into the background. And that's very difficult for them.
There was a very interesting point, though, in the Q&A when someone asks from the group of assembled journalists, how do the people of Scotland say no to independence? If a vote for the SNP is a yes for independence, Mr. Swinney would presumably not accept that a vote against the SNP is a vote against independence. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes, and if Labour win a majority of the seats, is that a mandate for the union? Should they just pack up and go home? And he wouldn't say that, would he? SNP MPs who I speak to admit that independence is a long way off. It's looking further and further away, and that is existential for the SNP, because what John Swinney was trying to do today is to say, I know you're concerned about the economy and public services and the NHS and a host of other things. He says he thinks independence is fundamental to achieving all those things, but it looks like a lot of voters don't think that. They just want the next government to be focusing on all of the things that they're concerned about.
Let's talk then, Tamara, about the policies contained in this manifesto. Although I suppose, given that the SNP are only standing in Scotland, these are less policies that would be enacted in government, more a wish list that they take to Westminster, or perhaps a list of demands on which they will agitate once they get there. What's contained in it? Yeah,
that's the important thing to say, that this is a manifesto for the whole of the UK, and the SNP are obviously not standing in the whole of the UK. They're not going to win the UK general election. So this is essentially fantasy politics. They're not going to deliver these things. They talk in there about the need to invest more money in the NHS. Their narrative in this general election is that Labour and the Tories are both committed to more austerity, that there's going to have to be billions of pounds of cuts to balance the books. Labour and the Tories are both on board with those, and the SNP are offering an alternative. And I thought John Swinney was admirably honest when I said who's paying for it, that he said that he thought taxes should go up to put £16 billion a year into the NHS. 10 billion to reverse cuts and 6 billion to strike pay deals for doctors and nurses. He said that is the best use of that money, and was unashamed about the fact that, like in Scotland, where people pay more income tax, they should pay more income tax across the UK in order to pay for that. There's also a host of other, what we could broadly call left-wing policies in there, including a social tariff for people who are elderly or on low incomes to have cheaper broadband and mobile phone contracts. And there are lots of other things in there that you could call the SNP's greatest hits. They want to reverse Brexit, which they say would add to the economy. They don't want to spend money on the nuclear deterrent. But this is not something that they can deliver, and is not something, importantly, that they are promising to deliver even in Scotland, where there has been a spending squeeze, as there has been everywhere else.
The point that you made to John Swinney himself is worth exploring, that the pro-independence voters are turning away from the one party in Scotland that could secure independence. And I wonder why you believe that's the case.
Yeah, there's been a whole sort of triple whammy of issues for the SNP. I think obviously things started to go wrong for them when Nicola Sturgeon stood down in March of last year. She was the most popular politician, and she had, of course, made a big name for herself during COVID. Support for independence was at its highest in recent years at the height of COVID. So the loss of her, and of course, all the issues with the police investigation, and then Humza Yousaf's time as leader and the turbulence there, all that has been a problem for the SNP. I think with Labour now riding so high in the polls, you are going to get people in Scotland who, after 40 years of the SNP saying we must have Scottish independence to avoid being ruled by the Tories, understandably, SNP supporters will think, OK, well, if Labour might get into government with lots of critical seats here in Scotland, we should hold our noses and vote Labour, even though they're not promising independence. And I think the SNP's answer to that is not a very convincing one. We heard from John Swinney today, Labour are definitely going to win, so people should vote for SNP MPs to hold them to account. Well, that's what some of the polls suggest. But of course, people might not fancy taking their chances. And they might feel like if they want a different government to the Conservative government, they need to vote for a Labour government. And I think that's certainly what we've been picking up here today.
Thank you, Tamara. Politicians, particularly those on the back foot like John Swinney and Rishi Sunak, are fond of reminding we pesky reporters that the only poll that counts is election day, that the data have been wrong in the past. And both are sort of true. Well, after all, political parties do as much polling ahead of an election as any news organisation. And if these polls are wrong, well, they've never been this wrong before. For now, it seems almost certain that there will be red flags flying rather than red faces all round come July the 5th. After all, when you're 20 points behind, a fortnight is a very short time in politics. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.